I call to order this hearing of the Europe, Eurasian, and Emerging Threats Subcommittee. As we begin today, I want to note that Congressman Meeks, the subcommittee's ranking member, is not with us today. He is recovering from a minor heart attack. We're grateful, very, very grateful that it is a small one, and that he's on his way to recovery. He's on the mend, and we are looking forward to having him back with us very soon. I know I speak for all my colleagues, and we wish him the very, very best. Turning the topic to this afternoon's hearing, I want to apologize for being late, but that's what happens when you have to do these hearings around votes. The topic of this afternoon's hearing is a massive and increasing tide of asylum seekers, economic migrants, stateless persons, and displaced people who have been and continue to enter Europe, as we have all seen in the videos and news reports. Migrants fleeing to Europe, they have been an issue of humanitarian concern for several years, but a wave of immigration erupted into a tsunami this summer when the German government announced it would ignore the Dublin rules and accept all Syrian refugees that made it to the German border. That announcement opened the gates for a flow of people to move from North Africa, the Middle East, and even Asia to transit through Greece, Turkey, the Balkans, and northward into Europe. With some notable exceptions, countries have simply facilitated the movement of migrants through their territory as quickly as possible, sometimes working to register the asylum seekers and sometimes not. While individual stories of tragedy and humanitarian need are compelling, the aggregate number of people on the move is overwhelming. Earlier this week, the United Nations announced that 218,000 migrants crossed the Mediterranean Sea to Europe just last month. That is more than were recorded in all of 2014. It is expected that around 1 million asylum seekers of all origins will reach Germany in this year alone. Germany and the EU are deeply divided about how to stem the flow of migrants and what to do with those who have already entered. Clearly, what we have seen over the past few months is unsustainable and, if not checked, will change the fundamental nature of European countries, which are now being inundated. What we are witnessing is the destruction of Western civilization, not by an armed invasion, but instead through envelopment. The effects of this will not soon disappear, but instead could well turn out to be an historic change in the nature of many European countries. Europe has been struggling to assimilate large Muslim populations. Increasing examples, they have seen this in Europe, increasing examples of anti-Semitism and radical Islamic violence clearly speak to the challenge of integration and the risks of failure in this situation. And that was before, of course, all of these, what we're talking about, these reports of this violence and anti-Semitism was before the current flow of immigrants began. Chancellor Merkel is full of confidence that Germany can educate, train, and turn refugees into productive and contributing members of society. But that is a tall task by any measure. Even the most optimistic scenarios say that Europe will have to redirect billions and billions of dollars from supporting their own citizens to accommodating the needs of these refugees. I hope in our conversation today we can examine and discuss the massive influx of people into Europe and what will be the consequences for European society, culture, and political institutions. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions and extraneous materials for the record. And I now will turn to Mr. Suri, who will give his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing on the migration and refugee crisis facing Europe, which many consider the worst migration and refugee crisis Europe has faced since World War II. What's with the sound system? Most of the migration is from refugees fleeing war-torn countries like Syria. The surge of migrants and refugees has significantly challenged and divided European countries, and the European Union. Many of the frontline states, such as Greece and Italy, find themselves overburdened with the influx of refugees and lack of sufficient resources to properly register and accommodate refugees and migrants. It is clear that the EU and Europe as a whole must do a better job at coordinating efforts across its borders to manage the large number of people in a humane manner. As we work with our European partners to respond to the refugee crisis, we must remember the toll influxes of people at borders can cause. We have struggled with our own borders to absorb the surge of women and children fleeing violence in Central America. We have learned firsthand the importance of providing a response to these victims that is both timely and humane. And most importantly, these crises remind us that we can't lose sight of addressing the root causes of migration and finding a political solution to the war in Syria. America has a long history of helping the world's most vulnerable people, and other countries look to the U.S. to lead when it comes to the refugee resettlement. The administration's recent announcement to accept 10,000 Syrian refugees was the first sign of a goodwill to those that are desperate to flee the turmoil. But we can do much more. In addition to increasing the number of refugees we accept from Syria, we can draw our own experiences and challenges regarding border security and provide assistance and increased coordination to our European allies to help them cope with the number of migrants and refugees. I look forward to hearing from our esteemed panel of witnesses on the best path forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing.
Does anyone else have an opening statement? Judge Poe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the crisis in Europe has resulted in thousands of refugees going to Europe. And not all of the people going into Europe are from trying to escape the Syrian war. Now we understand there are people from all over the Middle East, even as far away as Afghanistan, and all fleeing, looking to move to Europe for various reasons. Not all of them are seeking asylum or refugee status, but may have other motives in mind as well. I think part of the reason folks are moving so quick out of the Middle East and Syria is because Russia has gotten involved in Syria and is propping up Assad, trying to make sure he sticks around, and people see that their lives are in danger, so they leave the area. Obviously, Europe was not prepared for this tremendous influx of thousands and thousands of other people. I'm not sure that Europe has figured out a way to handle it, and I'm sure the United States, in my opinion, is not doing much to help in the crisis. Some countries take various positions on what to do with the migrants, let them pass through, or maybe not even let them come into their country. One such example is Hungary, who's trying to protect the national sovereignty of its own country, and the United States, rather than try to understand the situation in Hungary. Even last week, the U.S. ambassador dressed down the Hungarians for what the State Department believed was not the right course in dealing with migrants. That does nothing to help our relationship with Hungary, a NATO ally. It's obvious that there has to be something to be done with these thousands of individuals, and where are they going, and how long are they going to stay, and what is the United States going to do to help in this crisis? And I'm sure that our witnesses have all the answers to these questions. That's why they're here. So I will thank the chairman, and I'll yield back.
Mr. Weber, do you have a opening statement? Good to go. And I know as Ms. Frankel as well. Let me note that before we start that we have with us the distinguished ambassador from Hungary. Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate that. And let me just say that Hungary has been a tremendous friend and an asset to the peace and stability of the world. And I am personally upset that our administration has sought to find out and try to complain about every little thing they disagree with Hungary. Hungary has every right to set their own policies, and I am pleased that Hungary has a track record of doing good things with the United States, so we thank you. This is also the anniversary of the Hungarian Revolution, and all of us who fought communism for decades were inspired by the young people and others who rose up against the communist dictatorship in Budapest back in 1956. So that's, is that 60 years?
You were there.
I was there. That was a little bit later. So, but anyway, with that said, we have two really fine witnesses with us today. I would ask if you could try to get it to 5 minutes, and then we'll have a nice dialogue on that. I would like to introduce Dr. Gary Schiffman. He is a professor of the Security Studies Department at Georgetown University. His work focuses on exploring the relationship between economics and national security. Dr. Schiffman is also the founder of Giant Oak Incorporated, a company that meets the demand for social science-driven innovation in big data environments like institutions countering organized crime, money laundering, trafficking, insurgency, and terrorism. It is a pleasure to have Dr. Schiffman here to speak with us on this very important topic. Also, we have with us Dr. V. Bradley Lewis. He serves as associate professor in the School of Philosophy at Catholic University of America, where he has taught for nearly 2 decades. He also serves as an associate editor of the American Journal of Jurisprudence. Dr. Lewis specializes in political philosophy, Plato, legal philosophy, and natural law theory. We are delighted to have Dr. Lewis with us today, and again, ask him if Dr. Lewis and Dr. Schiffman could keep it about 5 minutes, and we'll have a nice dialogue. So thank you very much, Dr. Gary. You
Okay, is that better? There we go. I can offer 2 distinct perspectives on this challenge. First, as a behavioral scientist and as a former senior official at U.S. Customs and Border Protection. I have spent a lot of time thinking about how understanding essential characteristics of human behavior can inform our understanding of organized violence. I have divided my comments today into 3 sections. The first provides an economist's view of a way to think about security and the refugees. The second discusses my experience as a practitioner of national and homeland security. And third suggests a framework for policy options. 1, a behavioral economist's perspective. Economists see all human interactions as exchanges taking place within markets, with individuals, regardless of race, religion, or ethnicity, making decisions that maximize welfare for ourselves, our families, and our communities. Competitive marketplaces demand cooperation in order to maximize our goals, leading individuals to divide the world into us and them. Political violence, such as insurgency and terrorism, occurs when scarce conditions allow violence to become economically feasible. In other words, people choose violence when it is the best way to achieve their goals in the face of scarce resources. In Europe today, continuing mass refugee streams will continue to strain resources of European populations, creating conditions of scarcity that highlight competition and sharpen divides between host and refugee, between us and them. As we may have predicted, we're witnessing political parties imbuing rhetoric with divisive language, manipulating us versus them narratives and exacerbating tensions. This increasingly divisive rhetoric recalls historical examples of politicians using hate-creating stories to discredit opponents and better their own positions. Harvard economist Edward Glaser points to 3 examples: anti-black hatred in the American South, anti-Semitism in Europe, and anti-Americanism in the Arab world. These hateful narratives led Glaser to point out that when populations are socially isolated and politically relevant, stories of hatred are likely to take hold, and recruitment and violence can follow. European states and the EU stand at a crossroads between becoming a melting pot or remaining a federation of nations with distinct national, ethnic, and religious identities. The economist's view would suggest that regardless of the choice, policies that create politically relevant and socially isolated populations be avoided. So how do we do this? Section 2, Reflections as a Practitioner. Regarding security challenges, we focus on 2 primary vectors. First, the possibility for terrorists to embed themselves within refugee streams and the potential for radicalization among refugee communities. High levels of single men in the refugee populations raises concerns that extremist groups such as ISIL have embedded members in the refugee streams. Existing radicalization of European societies, coupled with the widening gulf between host and guest communities, raises real concerns on the potential for refugees to radicalize and become violent. With regard to border security, the United States offers an opportunity for comparison. The United States screens for terrorist risk factors throughout the screening and asylum processes. The United States does a good job of integrating immigrants and refugees when they arrive, and significantly, the United States does not require border states to take full responsibility for border security costs. Instead, the bulk of the responsibility is shared across the entire tax base of all states. This poses a comparative question. Is the European Union as a collective capable of sharing the costs and the benefits of screening and integration? To what extent should border states such as Hungary and Slovenia bear the brunt of this responsibility? Section 3, some thoughts on a response framework. The European Union is capable of benefiting from the refugee streams if it approaches the refugees as a source of needed workers while managing risks. Despite this potential benefit, EU member states may not have the capacity to address the speed and scale of the current flows, either from a fiscal or a security standpoint, especially in the border states where the initial asylum claims are made. Issues of preserving national identity are real and must be treated as legitimate policy goals. As a result, governments will need to choose who is permitted to enter Europe by increasing screening measures, limiting entry, and sharing the fiscal responsibilities. Screening measures might be improved through cooperation and data analysis. Limiting entry might focus either on the most vulnerable populations, such as women and children, or on populations fleeing from ISIL-controlled areas. And integrating refugee populations into the labor force might mitigate fears of radicalization by avoiding isolation and minimizing social welfare costs. So my 3 key takeaways. First, regardless of the decision made on numbers and locations of refugee flows, threats may emanate from socially isolated and politically relevant populations. 2, the EU can manage risks associated with terrorism and other organized violence, but perhaps not each member state possesses the capacities, so we need to think about shared costs and benefits. And 3, the EU is capable of benefiting from the refugee streams if it approaches the problem as an opportunity to integrate a needed workforce. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Rohrabacher and members of the subcommittee, it isn't often that a political philosopher is invited to speak to a congressional committee, and I'm honored by your invitation. I've been asked to speak about the present migration crisis in Europe from the perspective of political philosophy. Much of what we need to know about the migration crisis is simply empirical. How many persons are involved, where are they from, why are they migrating, etc. Philosophy has little to say about these questions. Rather, political philosophy is the business of understanding what principles or reasons should guide our political conduct and shape our institutions and laws. What are the starting points for our thinking about our actions as persons and communities? Our starting points are actual goods that direct all of our practical reasoning, and political philosophy must also be attentive to truths about how human beings characteristically behave, that is, about the stable aspects of human nature. Political communities provide a context for individuals and groups to pursue their own development. This context includes especially legal systems that authoritatively coordinate the actions and interactions of persons and groups. Political communities are required by and justified by the common good of the people who constitute them. By common good, I mean first, the integral development and flourishing of the persons who live in the community, and secondly, the whole ensemble of conditions that facilitate that development. It is these things that justify but also limit the exercise of political authority. Among the conditions required for persons and groups to thrive are the availability of resources, and these resources first come from the earth itself. And no things, no products from the earth, no parts of it naturally and originally belong to any particular persons. However, human nature suggests that those things are best maintained when they're shared out in some distribution of private property. And I believe that this explanation of private property is also the sound reason for the existence of different territorial political communities. Governments and their constituents together are analogous to property owners in the sense that they represent a determinate agency responsible for the maintenance of the necessary conditions in a recognized territory or jurisdiction, justified by the directedness of that agency and those conditions to the common good of their people. Public order, the security of persons, both individuals and groups, and their property and freedom are essential elements of the common good and are best protected by particular governments with clear jurisdictions. The common good is more than merely a set of laws and institutions. It includes a common culture, among the elements of which are, for example, a common language, at least one common language, and shared sentiments of attachment and common membership. Such sentiments are an indispensable support for the maintenance of legal and political institutions and make possible the sacrifices that are necessary for the preservation of any political community over time. This is especially the case with respect to modern democracies, which tend to be large and which often encompass considerable diversity of ethnicities, religious faiths, and moral views among their populations, in addition to the social mobility and dynamism characteristic of modern economies. The role of shared practices, values, and sentiments in the maintenance of stable political communities that really do promote the common good of their citizens was known to Plato and Aristotle at the very beginning of the tradition. Aristotle in particular elaborated the notion of political friendship based on a fundamental agreement or like-mindedness about the purpose, structure, and practices of the political system. In the 19th century, Alexis de Tocqueville famously made the habits and mores of the people central to his account of how democratic political institutions were maintained in the United States. The willingness of citizens not only to defend one another through military service, but also to consent in the sort of redistributive taxation common to contemporary welfare states assumes a sense of common membership and shared values and sentiments. Without these things, the maintenance of communities and their institutions would require the application of coercive force on a far greater scale than we associate with free societies. Similarly, among these supports for free government are more generic but nevertheless dearly bought values like the rule of law, an atmosphere in which legal and natural rights of persons are acknowledged and protected by the law, with habits of civility and mutual forbearance that are informed by civic and political friendship. The common good of the political community is challenged, if not threatened, by the sudden and disorderly influx of large numbers of foreigners. And so the very common good that justifies political authority also justifies, I would say requires, government's concern about who enters their territory, and even more importantly, about the assimilation of immigrants into the community. Both the need to protect public order and the need to assimilate justify concern about the number of immigrants into the country and their character. A large group of immigrants who come predominantly from a distinct region of the world with its own culture that is significantly different from that of their country of destination presents an obvious challenge that no government could responsibly ignore. Indeed, there may be particularly urgent concerns if the immigrant group contains large numbers of persons who are from places where genuinely political community has not emerged and where social life is still dominated by family and tribal loyalties, or who are reasonably believed to hold views that are inconsistent with democratic political institutions and the protection of basic human rights, especially the equal legal rights of women and religious freedom. Large numbers, hastily or heedlessly admitted, can not only strain a country's material infrastructure of social support, but its legal system and larger political culture. Moreover, it could set in motion changes the full import of which may not be immediately apparent, but which could lead to various forms of social and political instability later. The collision we witness today in Europe amidst numbers of immigrants from a distinct civilization with the demographic collapse of Western European countries, countries with birth rates well below replacement levels, cannot but have far-reaching consequences not only for the internal politics of those countries, but also for the neighboring countries of Central and Eastern Europe, and at some stage for the United States as well, since we cannot now know what kind of political pressure may eventually be brought to bear on those countries' governments relative to the character and future of the Western Alliance. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. This has been more philosophical than I expected, but that's fine. Wonder if, Mr. Lewis, do you think that Merkel reads Aristotle? Is that part of what the decision-making process, or do you think that the people there are just trying to cope with a crisis of the moment?
Yeah, I don't know much more about the Chancellor's thinking than I read in the newspapers, and my impression is that she's coping with a very difficult and stressful situation. But I think it's becoming clear that the strains that are resulting from this are going to have political consequences for her, but are already having consequences for other countries. So I don't know on what basis she's making these decisions. I think it's probably very improvisational.
Dr. Schiffman, do you see this influx? And it was interesting you went down to an analysis of when violence happens, and when you put these factors together that we now see as the new reality in Europe, is by your analysis, is that then going to be that will result in violence one way or the other in the months and years to come?
Mr. Chairman, I hope not. And first, let me say that this is the most esoteric congressional hearing probably in a long time. So I appreciate the committee, taking on these sort of more philosophical ideas. The idea that Professor Lewis was talking about and how that merges with what I'm talking about is, these ideas that create cohesion among a society are important, and this is what allows for the provision of public goods and peace and stability. And all of that is absolutely at risk right now. You're absolutely right, as you said in your opening statement. What I tried to point to in my comments are, well, if you're not able to stem the flow, then what are the things that we need to think about? When we need to think about this idea of social isolation and political relevance. That's what sort of the economic literature would suggest. What that means is, and if you look at some of the examples that I cited, you've got this group that doesn't integrate, that's seen as outsiders. They're seen as others. They're not us, they're them, but they might be in my country now. And there might be some detriment to me from them being here. Right? And that's a great opportunity for what I would call entrepreneurs of violence to step forward and talk about recruitment and inciting things that we don't want to see. So those are the things I would point to.
Well, we did see, we here in our own country, where we had some people young men who immigrated from Chechnya and leaving their roots behind to come here to live in a freer and more benevolent society, and ended up committing a brutal act of terrorism and murdering some of our fellow citizens. And in terms of prefacing your remarks, stemming the flow, just for the record, I think that Hungary was totally justified in what it is doing to try to stem the flow. And frankly, if our European allies are not willing to stem the flow of large numbers of people who are not native to their territory, they will lose their territory. And let me note, I believe that's true of the United States as well. And we can be proud that we bring in 1 million people, immigrants, into our country every year, more than every other country of the world combined in terms of legal immigration. But we are making sure that, as you noted in your testimony, that we have a screening process, and we are bringing people in who then can be enculturated and assimilated into our society. That's what, according to your testimony, will, I'll say, minimize the chance of some kind of damage. I don't think that's possible in Europe. Do you have a comment on what's going on there now in relationship? Are these going to be unassimilated populations which will then lead to violence? One's for both of you.
So I don't want to comment on the specifics of any particular European country and what they're doing, but I think from the reading of the newspapers, absolutely this is something that we need to be concerned about, and that's why I'm flagging it in my testimony for you all, is to the extent that the flow is too fast and you can't do proper screening and vetting, that's the first threat vector, which is sort of the terrorist integrating within the flow. And then the second is even if when they enter, they're not ISIS affiliated, what's the threat from radicalization? And that's where I point to those two ideas of socially isolated and politically relevant, and that's something that if we can't slow it down, then we have to worry about it whether we slow it down or not. But those are the things that I suggest the committee think about as they hear further testimony from other folks more expert on the specific policies of the European Union.
Like to comment on that, Dr. Lewis?
I mean, I would simply underline the point that both of us have mentioned about the importance of assimilation. And the problem in the particular case we're talking about here is the numbers of people in the short period of time in which they're coming in. They're talking about possibly as many as 1.5 million refugees into Germany just this year, and I think one has to remember that that's on top of millions of refugees that have come in the last 5, 6, 7 years. Germany's a country of 80 million people, so you can sort of do the math. At a certain point, the percentage creeps up, and the question of the ability of the country to assimilate those immigrants is crucial. The United States is a much larger country, and historically, I think we've done a much better job of assimilating immigrants than European countries have.
Well, we, of course, have a culture that is we accept everybody in. That's what our culture is all about, is being proud of the individual rights that people have in terms of their own backgrounds. And so that's not necessarily what keeps the European cultures together. Our belief in liberty and our belief in human rights are supposed to be something that unites us as Americans. In other areas, they have cultural elements that unite them as a people, a particular religion and some particular customs that they have. And I think that Europe is, frankly, this massive influx is going to be, as I mentioned in my opening statement, I believe is going to change the very nature of Europe. And we have seen an historic event, and I believe based on the fact that people who are not courageous enough to control their own borders will soon lose their country. There'll be some other people there, and people who will have different values and different cultures, and that could happen in the United States as well. With that said, Mr. Series, would you like to have your time? Use my microphone here. There we go.
Thank you. Well, having been a refugee myself at the age of 11 and coming to this country, I can tell you from experience that I think the assimilation process in this country has a way of absorbing you and making you part of this country. And if you talk to my brother and my younger brother who was born here, I mean, they have very little remnants of what it was to grow up in Cuba like I did. I came a little old, I was 11 years old. My concern, I mean, is that these countries do not have the welcoming that this country has for these refugees. And I understand that because these are not large countries. And if you have an influx of people very different from your culture, they stand to congregate and basically stand apart from the rest of the country, which I think eventually is going to hurt those countries. Because they'll want to keep their own culture. They do not want to be part of the country that they're in. I don't know, this country here is very different. You want to be part of this country. At least that was with my family. And I can see where Hungary would want to close its borders. Then it's not a large country. They don't have the resources. I can see for some of the other countries closing the borders. It's very different situation that we have here. Now, Germany needs workers. But I think even now they're starting to rethink the amount of people that they need and the amount of people they're going to accept. And, you know, my question is, which of the countries has been most impacted? What countries have been most impacted by this influx of refugees? Can Dr. Schiffman?
So let me address your first point, Congressman, which is there's putting this back into economic terms, right? There's a trade-off. Everything's a trade-off, and you know, the United States, we have the melting pot. The phrase I used in my testimony. We have this identity of we're the melting pot. We have hyphenated Americans, and that's fine, right? I'm a Cuban American, a Russian American, a whatever American, and that's welcoming here, and that's a wonderful thing, and that has led to what makes us great, as the chairman said, and that's also contributes to economic growth and development and GDP growth and trade and all of these other things. There's a trade-off that European states have to make right now, which is they need the workers. But that is going to, they can get workers and they can get GDP growth. They can get economic growth at the cost of that melting pot, right? And are the European states really ready for a melting pot approach? Do they want hyphenated, fill in the blank, or do they want to keep their national identity? That's the nature of the trade-off right now. My third point is that there is an economic opportunity here, right? There is an opportunity for increasing GDP growth, but it's going to cost you culturally. It's going to cost you ethnically and nationally, and that may not be what people are willing to do. I don't think they are, and if that's the case, then the rest of my testimony is, well, how do we address what really might backfire on us, which is, where's the violence going to come from? And that's what I think we need to focus on.
And I think the influx has been so quickly, so many, that the security issue is very important. I remember as a boy when my father was taken away when we first arrived for about 4 or 5 days, and my father went through a whole process. Did you participate in the Communist Party? Were you involved in the Communist Party back then? And after, after the 4 or 5 days, he was returned to us. I don't think these countries have any way of screening the people that are going through there, like what we went through when I first arrived here. So to me, I agree with the notion that these countries could be taking in some people that are going to basically try to disrupt that country or disrupt Europe. And for those countries, it's very difficult to keep letting people in their countries who are not screened like they were.
So my quick response, In the US, the reason we build walls on our border is to slow the flow and to direct the flow where we can screen people. That's why we have walls on the US borders. If you look at high-density urban populations, without a wall, people run across the US-Mexican border, and within 60 seconds, they're in a safe house. We put a wall up, slows them down, so they either have to try to get through the deserts of Arizona, or they have to go through a port of entry, right? So walls make sense when it comes to securing borders. That's a good thing. And so when we see it applied in Europe, it's the same idea. The broader point I tried to make in my testimonies also is, this isn't a Texas problem. This is a U.S. problem. So when we think about Europe, we need to think about how do we stem the flow, how do we slow it down, how do we get control of it, how do we do screening in a way that it's not just Hungary's problem, but it's something that is collectively addressed both in the cost and the benefit side.
The other aspect of this is that I think that people that come here eventually want to become American citizens and participate in the process. I know my grandmother was 83 years old when she first became a citizen, so she could vote for her grandson. Obviously she never learned the language. Absolutely, more than once. But it's just it was a process, and no matter how much you try to teach her English or anything, she would never learn English. And my mother used to say that if she ever lost this finger in this country, she'd be a mute, because she used to go to the store and say one, that's how she brought things. But you assimilate.
Right.
And this country has a way of just taking you in. I don't think these countries have that capacity. And I don't know if the people, and we want it to be assimilated, quite frankly. And those people that are going to these countries, I don't know if they want to be assimilated. Would you agree with that, Dr. Lewis?
Yeah, I think that's a real question at the moment. I mean, there's sort of two important things here I would mention. One is that the influx of refugees, which is quite heavy here at the moment, comes in combination with the demographic problems, the loss of growth in natural fertility in most Western European countries, well below replacement, and that's why they need workers from the outside. But what's crucial is to have an orderly process of immigration. My wife's grandparents came over here from Italy, and her father, who largely grew up here with those parents, became a decorated veteran of World War II, loved the United States, learned that being here, acquired those sentiments of attachment to the country, and with willingness to sacrifice for it. That takes time, and it requires a kind of orderly process, and that's what's not there at the moment.
Not there. The absorption in those countries is not there either, like it is here. For some reason, we drink espresso, but then we like coffee too. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Let's just note that Cuban Americans have done pretty well, and they've done so well in assimilating that I predict that there will be a Cuban American as President of the United States, but I won't tell you which one. And let me also just note here, when we're talking about the assimilation of people into the United States in the last 50 years during the Cold War, I mentioned the Hungarian uprising. The people who came here during the Cold War, and there were many, many people who, escaping communism, came here. They came here and helped us to thwart this evil theory of communism that threatened world peace. Their assimilation helped us as Americans understand when their neighbors saying, oh my gosh, they won't even let people worship God the way they want in communist countries. That alerted the American people to a threat. Unfortunately, what it appears that many of the people who are arriving here from the Middle East who are Islamic are not here and enemies of the radical Islam that drove them here. And in fact, just the opposite. Sometimes you have people who come here and expect that they're going to have their women covered up. And quite frankly, I think that's an insult to our values as a people. And not to mention people who come here from Islamic countries who think they can still have honor killings and things such as this. That's not assimilation, and that's a threat to, and on top of it, they aren't, unlike the Cubans who came here who were enemies of communism, these people aren't necessarily enemies, well, they're not enemies at all of Islam. And I'm not saying people that Islam is the enemy, but certainly radical Islam is. And anyone who comes here should be part of the team. And I can say Cuban Americans, we're proud of you guys. I mean, you Cubans and Americans have done so much for our country, as so many of our immigrants that have come here from elsewhere, like your father-in-law from Italy, as such. And I'll leave that with Judge Poe, who's got some insights for us as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. Professor Lewis, I'm intrigued that you study and teach natural law. I didn't know that anybody did that in the country anymore. I'm a great fan of natural law and the history, especially the founding of our country under the theory of natural law. I've been to Turkey and I've seen the refugee camps. When I was in, had about 180,000 people from Syria. And this problem is increasing because, of course, of the situation that we're all aware of in Syria, where you got Assad, you got rebels, and a mixed bag of a bunch of folks. We don't know who they all are. And then we have ISIS all in there trying to control it, and the Russians have come in and tried to make a power struggle, and everybody's running for the hills. The people coming into Europe, we don't know who they all are because we don't know who they are. And it seems to me that they're everybody. They are those genuine refugees that are running for their lives because of Assad or ISIS. They're people looking for economic opportunities. They're people who are coming into Europe maybe to cause mischief, but various reasons. And if I understand what's been reported about their migration, the goal seems to be for a large amount of them to go into Europe, Eastern Europe, move into Germany, and then even move up into the Nordic states. And there's no end in sight until we run out of people. I read some estimates that there's going to be 5 million folks moving into Europe. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a lot of folks coming in. There's no unified plan on what to do with all those people or who's going to pay for it. One of the, I think, issues of any nation is to protect its sovereignty or its integrity, however you want to define that. But part of that is knowing who comes into their country and deciding whether they can stay or not. But main thing, know who they are, identify them. And early on, it looked like people were just coming into Europe and going wherever they could get and never did know who they were. I think countries like the border European Union countries specifically, like Hungary, not only have a right but an obligation to find out who's coming into their country. And for the U.S. to second guess them and belittle them, and our soap opera ambassador dress them down last week, I thought that was a big mistake. Because if I understand the way the system works, if a country identifies someone at their border that's a refugee, and the person keeps moving, let's say to Germany, gets to Germany, Germany may have the ability and authority to send them back to the original border entry country. Is that your understanding, either one of y'all, under the current agreement in the European Union? Either one of you know?
The current rules under the Dublin rules, I think, have been largely dispensed with. I think those were the rules, but I think there really aren't many rules at the moment.
So we don't have any. We don't know what could happen to the migrant that gets all the way to Germany or to France or to Sweden, and that country decides you're not staying here. They go back to where they came from or the original entry country. That seems to me to promote just chaos in Europe. Europe is what, 500 million? United States is 360 million or so. And you have lots of people coming in. It would just seem to me that nations would have the authority to identify and track and find out who's coming in. And then, as my friend from New York pointed out, what is the purpose of folks coming in? Are they coming in to assimilate into whatever country, or are they coming in to form another culture in a country? I think France has found that they've had this problem with assimilation of people who come to their country. I guess my question is, what should the United States be doing? Now, we're observing and criticizing, but what should we be doing about this migration issue in Europe?
So, Judge Poet, I agree with the way you've laid it out very nicely. The direct concern to the United States is, so to the extent that this happens and these folks, mass migrations happen into Europe, they're now in visa waiver countries. And so now they come to the United States, right? So this very quickly becomes a United States, national security issue. So we absolutely have an interest in this immediately. My comments about the way Europe could handle this better is to look at some of the things that we've learned here. First of all, the border states aren't solely responsible for this, right? This is
You mean financially?
Financially, fiscally, right? Looking at the border states of
And right now, is it your understanding that the border, every country's kind of on their own as far as paying for the migrants that are there?
Again, with the caveat, I'm not an EU follower, but that's my understanding, is the burden is falling disproportionately on the border states for doing that screening, which makes absolutely no sense for U.S. national security, let alone for Europe's national security. As you said, we need to use your phrase, which I like, we have to know first and foremost who it is, and second, why they're coming. We're not built to do that right now in Europe, and it seems what the United States needs to do is be a part of fixing that, right? This is.
I'm just send you over there with your expertise in ICE and border security.
So, well, the United States government knows an awful lot about border security. I was fortunate enough to be a part of the early days of DHS here. Lots of folks have experience that could be beneficial to the European Union. I think they need to address it as the European Union, though, and this isn't Hungary's problem, this is the EU's problem, and by extension, the United States as well.
I'm about out of time, Professor. In fact, I am. Do you want to weigh in on that?
Well, just, the statement that I prepared and submitted ahead of time, one element of it is that it's an absolute first responsibility of national governments to protect the common good of the people of those countries, to secure the rule of law and the protection of the fundamental rights of those people. And they have that. It's a very solemn obligation for the governing authority of any country. And now there's a natural tendency and a correct tendency to want to be generous and hospitable to immigrants. There are compelling humanitarian reasons for that. And I think, the Germans have tried to do that, maybe over-tried in some ways. But it has to be understood that the first responsibility of governments is to protect the security of their people. And some of these issues really could have an impact there. Just yesterday's Wall Street Journal, there was a story about forged passports and the market in forged passports for people coming into Europe. Now, usually what they do is apparently throw the passports away once they get to their country of destination, and then they're equipped with a whole new set of identity documents, which could then be used to travel to other places as well. And there may be no way of knowing where they originally came from or what their intentions are. And it's a matter of internal security, justified function of government to police that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Frankel?
Thank you very much. Well, we could talk about border security and sovereign rights all day. Here's the cruel fact of it all. We're dealing with the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II. Then these people, they have to go somewhere because they're getting killed and tortured and they're starving. It's a horrible situation. first question I'd like you to comment, answer if you want to weigh in, which I think is important for our public to understand, and that is, because we're looking at all this afar, and I think we can understand the humanitarian part of this. I'd like your opinion on whether what's happening now in Europe, how that would affect our own economic or national security here in the United States. What are the long-term implications?
So first, let me agree that this is, it's hard not to think of this first and foremost as a humanitarian crisis that we all have to take very seriously. And I think, for myself, that was my first response as well. As a national security professional, you're still sort of, the humanitarian component of this still comes first to mind. So in my testimony, as I suggested, Ms. Frankel, there may be ways, if you're not going to let everybody in, and as Judge Poe said, not everybody's coming for the same reasons, right? Not everybody is coming in because they're persecuted and fleeing for their lives. They see an opportunity to get into Europe and get into Northern Europe and get into a nice welfare state, right? So if we can screen out, which is hard to do, if we can screen out, then it makes sense to me to focus on the most vulnerable populations first. And that's something I think we know how to do. At least the United States knows how to do that.
Okay, I think well, thank you for saying what you said, but maybe my question wasn't clear. I think it's important for us for our public here in the United States to understand that there are economic consequences and potential national security consequences if we ignore what's going on in Europe and in Syria and other parts parts of the region that are affected by these refugees. I thought maybe you could comment on that. Yeah.
Sure. As I pointed out in my testimony, what concerns me is having unintegrated populations that have political relevance, and that's what I think historically, when we look back, tends to provide the opportunity for violence, definitely instability. So as Professor Lewis said, right, these shared, the common good, these shared stories, these shared languages, these are all ways in which we integrate populations, as Mr. Siri said. If we fail to do that, if they come in anyways in large numbers and they fail.
All right, well, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I think maybe this is just not in your area of expertise. That's not a criticism, all right? I mean, I think there are economic consequences and security consequences if we ignore what's going on, but not because we're afraid of terrorists coming in. I mean, quite frankly, I think most of the people who are that are fleeing Syria are innocent people who are good, decent people, and they're not going to threaten our lives. I think the bigger threat is if we do nothing. So I'll go to another subject then, all right? Which is, and I think maybe Mr. Poe started to get in this with you, but do you think that the United States should give more financial aid to or towards the refugees that are now going into Europe? Because I know we're doing that we're doing it in Syria, we're doing it in Lebanon. We're the displaced refugees in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey. Do you have an opinion as to whether or not we should increase our efforts in Europe?
No, ma'am. I don't know how much we're giving, and if it's
okay. So that's outside your.
It's outside of.
And I guess our philosopher over here, you just no comment.
Yeah, I mean, the United States is a generous country, and I hope it continues to be generous, but as far as exactly how much money is available for what, I just don't know.
Okay, all right. You know what? But I did enjoy your testimony, and I think I'll yield back, Mr. Chair.
Very much. Mr. Weber.
Dr. Lewis, you said in your prepared remarks, and I'm paraphrasing, that private property doesn't belong to anyone. Would you go back through that for me, please?
Yeah, what I was talking about there was the resources that people need to live. The most important ones come initially just from the earth itself. And my point was at the beginning, if we sort of mentally put ourselves back, you might say, just hypothetically at the beginning of the world, no particular piece of the earth belongs to any particular person, naturally.
And yet
People acquire things.
you recognize from biblical days that there was properties bought and sold, for example. So sometime back thousands of years ago, that process began.
Because of facts about human nature, the fact that we tend to take care of things more effectively when we own them, and
Right.
people quarrel over things, it makes sense
And that's
that
where
things be parceled out
well,
into
that's
private
where I was
property.
going to go. I mean, because if ownership actually, I would submit makes people be better stewards of
Absolutely.
their property.
But I was making an analogy to territory itself, that particular governments are better stewards of their territory and of the order of their territory than having no particular governments and borders and so forth.
So, in your estimation, is Hungary being a good steward of their borders?
From what I can tell, Hungary is doing what they think is necessary to protect their
That's-
national security.
That's what I want to hear, especially with our ambassador sitting here. Dr. Schiffman, you said that opportunity for economic growth for all of these refugees or immigrants coming in, but don't you think that perhaps it's going to be an overburdening on the infrastructure? I mean, you talk about an opportunity for economic growth. Is there no downside that you see? I'm talking about economically now.
Yeah, right. In terms of sort of just per capita GDP growth, it most certainly is a net benefit, but it might not be a benefit for everybody. So I'll give you an example, and we face this in the United States with having open borders and free trade and stuff like that. So there are certainly individuals who will lose out on an economic opportunity as other people come in and replace them.
Is there a time frame involved? I mean, they're not going to get that economic benefit in the first 6 months or year, right? They're going to be really overburdened for a while?
So what I would do is go back to the points we've been talking about, is knowing who's crossing the border. I imagine there are some folks who are highly trained, highly educated, who will be able to contribute to the economy right away. There might be other folks who, might take a generation.
Well, let me address part of that open border. You mentioned the United States actually has the responsibility for. I come from Texas.
Yes, sir.
I was in the Texas legislature, and my second term, I was the vice chair of the Borders Committee. And I can tell you things about our southern border. Of the 2,000 miles that the United States has with Mexico, Texas has about 1,167 miles, almost two-thirds of them. And it would scare you. The years that I were there, the 4 years I were there, the Texas legislature put $200 million in border security. Unfortunately, the United States did not. After I left, they came in and put $400 million. The first term I was gone, and the last term they put over $500 million in. So I want to make that plug for not only the great state of Texas, but to point out the country of the United States is not really shouldering up under the responsibility of securing our southern border. Okay, it's interesting to me, and I'm trying to read my notes while I'm talking. One of you said that maybe the European Union ought to shoulder up under that burden and pony up some money. Was that you, Doctor? Was it you? Okay. How do you expect to make that happen if we can't get the United States to do that?
I don't intend to make it happen. I'm just suggesting to the committee some things that you might want to take up in your conversations.
That's a battle that we might not be able to win.
Understand.
And then let's see. Dr. Schiffman, you also said in your discourse with Congresswoman Frankel that the humanitarian component of the crisis has to come up first. But at what point, you were talking about, she was talking about people being taken in, that they were, I'm not trying to put words in Lois's mouth, but I think she said they were all pretty friendly and nice, most of them, insinuating that we ought to be willing to take some of them in was, I guess, where she was going with that. But at what point does the humanitarian concept of our citizens take precedent because of the danger? Would you speak to that?
Sure, the precedence of our citizenship, should our citizens come first?
Should be first and foremost.
First and foremost, yes, sir.
Okay. How do you balance those two?
Through this political process that we're taking part
Okay.
in here.
Are you aware that about 3:20 today, CNN is reporting that the United States intelligence are saying that they believe a bomb brought the airliner down in Egypt, a bomb on board the plane? So when you talk about people coming over and either assimilating into their, I remember which one once said that there was a problem that maybe terrorists would be embedded in the refugee stream, or that once they got there, they would radicalize others in the nation. Well, I think what we're seeing is the effect of some radicalization, some terrorism right now. Do you know how many men and women and children lost their lives on that airliner? It's about 230 something, wasn't it? So I'm just struggling with the idea that somehow we have to focus on the humanitarian crisis to the exclusion of our own citizens' safety. That's just a huge concern to me. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. Just a few thoughts. And Mr. Series, do you have a 1 minute or so, 2 minute closing statement?
I just wanted to thank you, and I'm still very concerned about the long-term impact of the constant refugee flow into Europe. Yeah, I think it's going to disrupt some of these countries because they just don't have the money or the ability to take in this population. So I think we have to just keep an eye on this situation, because eventually we're going to have to be very make sure that the security of this country comes first.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the witnesses, and just a few thoughts that the massive influx and out of control influx that we see in Europe is not simply a European phenomena. Although I believe that one of the factors that we have to look at, historic factors in Europe, that Europe lost tens of millions of young men in World War I and World War II. And during that time period, those young men disappeared from the population equation. Thus, the children of the people who were prevented from having children because they died at a younger age, and their children don't exist, and you go right down the how many people exist. Europe would probably have many more, maybe hundreds of millions, maybe 100 million more people had those people killed in these vicious wars not been eliminated from the equation. And thus we see Europe that is underpopulated now from what it would have been except for war. During that time period, there wasn't a massive war of extermination going on in the Middle East and in the Muslim parts of the world. That's bound to. We also see the effect of abortion on Europe. Abortion has been a major factor in limiting the population in Europe. And again, the babies that have been aborted in the last 50 years don't have children, who don't have children, and thus you have a shrinkage of population going on. With that, we face a population where we have people who were having families of 6 and 7 and 8 people. And when you have societies juxtaposed like that, it's going to have an impact, and we're seeing it now. And with that said, that massive influx, however, should not be looked at as only a possible European situation. In the United States, I believe this influx was started when Merkel decided that she would then change the policy, and anybody who could get to Germany they were going to take them in. Well, when that word went out, all of a sudden, trying to stop the flow of immigrants illegally into Europe became untenable. That is the same dynamic at play in the United States. When the poor people of the world figure out that they can come here, and once they get here, they're going to be able to get a job, they're going to be able to get government benefits, just like everybody else. There will be the out-of-control massive inflow that Europe is right now, to the point that it might change or undermine the basic cultural elements that unite all of us. And that is a great threat. We should be taking a lesson here, because whether it's, and I'm not just talking about, most people, unfortunately, the immigration debate has been focused on Mexico, and this is not a Mexican problem. This is an idea that if once the word goes out to the world, we have a major illegal immigration from China now and in Asia. We also have people from all over Latin America. And if we put out the same message that Merkel put out for her country, we will have the same out-of-control influx into our society, and we're on the edge of that right now. So let us learn the lesson of Europe. Thank you for joining us and giving us your insights, both philosophically and practically. And with that said, this hearing, one moment. I'm going to announce one thing. At the close of the hearing, I thought I would announce, tomorrow I will be submitting a piece of legislation that suggests that those people in Middle Eastern countries that are now suffering from radical Islamic terrorism, those countries in which Christians have been targeted for genocide, that when it comes to immigration and refugee status, that those Christians who are targeted for genocide will have priority over other people in trying to find refuge in the United States. I'll be dropping that bill tomorrow. Thank you very much. This hearing is adjourned.